Okay, so how do you ensure that your project can get the tax credit that we just talked about? You can safe harbor your project. So there's two ways to do that. The first way is called the 5% test, and the second way is called the physical work test. The 5% test is generally the easier way, especially for projects that have a long development cycle. For example, if your building's not going to come out of the ground until mid 2026 or the end of 2026, it's impossible for me to physically start working on site, right? So you would use the 5% test to safe harbor the project. And the way you do that is you simply incur 5% of the project cost. It's literally that simple. Qualifying costs include modules, inverters, racking, and electrical equipment specific to the solar project, and any design engineering for example, for carports can count as a qualifying cost. And so the easiest way to do that is usually modules. So what we do is we just calculate how many modules you would need to purchase to get to this 5% test, and then we would store them either on site or on an offsite facility. It's relatively easy to do. You just need to simply incur that cost. Some things that don't qualify for the 5% test are like site clearing or prep work or general design work that isn't specific to the project. The second way is called the physical work test. And this is where you actually begin work of a significant nature. You're on site, you're actually installing things, the project is actually started. You can also use offsite fabrication, for example, of carports. If you have a fabricator offsite who's erecting the steel or fabricating the steel specific for your project, that also counts as beginning construction of a significant nature. The work must be continuous. And so once you start work, you can't stop. And so you need to actually start construction. They made it pretty clear with this bill that you have to actually start work and continue. For example, you can't just go and dig a trench and put a piece of conduit in and say we started work. That's not going to fly. Okay, some things that don't qualify: financing, design work, basic site clearing, stuff like that doesn't count. You actually have to start work on the project and continue. Next slide. Okay, so how do you safe harbor? First thing would be to get a quote and engage with us, right? To try to understand what the project costs are, what the financial benefits are, how you integrate Ivy's product into the project, and how you can understand how you're going to finance the deal. Sign a contract with us, determine the best way to safe harbor pathway. Again, I think most of them will be that 5% test. We'll get into a little bit more details on that in a minute, but it's possible to do the safe harbor test. So determine your best path forward there, and then keep accurate and complete records and documentation. This will be important, okay? The first 5% specifically is very important, where you need to show that, hey, I bought these panels specific for this project. I safe harbored it. Here are the receipts. Here's the invoice. Here's the payment. Keep all that accurate and complete information, because you'll need it to go claim the tax credit when you do, which is step 5. Once the project is complete and operational, then you go and claim your tax credit.
Cool. Thanks, Ross. So here's some of those dates that he was mentioning that we have to have on our radar. I'll go over them a little bit more details as we move forward. And just as a word of caution, some of these do seem a little bit further away, but as you know, in construction, nothing's quite as fast as you would like it to. And each one of these dates has a pretty steep cliff associated with them. So it's important that you work tightly with your solar contractor to make sure that you're very mindful of what these dates can mean. So shortly after the One Big Beautiful Bill was signed, the president asked the IRS to redefine what safe harboring actually means. So the decision that went into effect on September 2nd is that any project over 1.5 megawatts AC is not eligible for that 5% test. So they have to do the physical work test. The good news is in multifamily, a lot of your projects are probably going to be under this side and still eligible for that 5% rule, which is the simpler way to safe harbor. But what this does show us is that this administration is pretty serious about cracking down on this and making sure that we're moving things along quickly. So starting on January 1st of 2026, any new agreements must consider prohibited foreign entities or PFE rules. A lot of people on the call are probably more familiar with the term FIA or foreign entity of concern. These are basically the same thing. The administration changed the term from FIA to PFE and added a few additional considerations. The one that we're most concerned about in the solar world, the country that we're most concerned about, is China, but Russia, Iran, and North Korea are also included here. And then next year, we won't be able to use any materials that are directly owned or under the effective control of any of the PFEs. So on the surface, this isn't a huge concern because there's plenty of manufacturers, including ones here in America, that aren't going to be directly impacted by this rule. With that said, though, getting flashbacks of my economics class because it's going to turn into a supply and demand thing. Some of the major suppliers that are being pushed out of Chinese production that are still eligible for the ITC are going to be in really high demand. High demand means limited availability, which could potentially mean higher prices or tighter supply chains. Cool. So we've decided to safe harbor. So the next obvious question is, when do I have to have this built? So there's a couple of different dates that you really need to look at. So the earlier is better. The second stage here applies a little bit of complexity, but it's still very feasible on this timeline. The third option is it's July 5th, 2026. You weren't able to safe harbor, and now you're looking at putting on solar on a building, and you're still really hoping to get those tax credits. This is still technically possible, but you've turned what was a nice marathon pace into an absolute sprint. So in order to secure the ITC and all the eligible bonuses, you must finish the project by the end of 2027, 12/31/2027, which means you now have 18 months or less to go from contract to power on. So it's definitely possible, but speed and efficiency are really going to come into play. You're going to have concerns about supply chain, crew availability, and you have to cross your fingers a little bit that the utility and interconnection process is super smooth. I would recommend avoiding the situation if at all possible, because the earlier dates are a lot easier to work with. And then you throw in new construction into this. So that adds a little bit of complexity to everything. Sometimes your building's not built. You're not sure how much solar you need, when you need to put it on, how much solar that's going to end up being with all your Title 24 requirements and all of those extra considerations. So new construction's on a different timeline altogether. We do recommend moving as quickly as you can to safe harbor those projects. But as an added security for you guys, we've been talking about this 5% rule, 5% rule, 5% rule. Here at HES, we've actually internally made it a 7% rule for new construction. And the reason for this is to add that extra layer of security for you guys. As your building is changing, you're moving your mechanical equipment around, you're doing all of these things that happen in construction. It's a very fluid process. There's going to be changes to the solar. And the biggest concern is if that solar cost goes up, and you're no longer met the 5% rule by what you spent early on to safe harbor it, you're technically at risk of losing your ITC. So as that extra layer of protection, we're doing a 7% standard material procurement cost at the beginning of the project to help ensure that safe harbor happens.